They also encourage us to go ahead, even with small numbers of people, because that would be useful for them.
No sick time. We have no such thing as sick time. You are penalized with attendance points for any day that you call out sick.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. We start with a massive march for Ukraine in Bologna, Italy. We need many marches for Ukraine in the U.S., especially with the new Congress and the majority in the House that may be hostile to the cause of Ukrainian freedom. This group of Ukrainians sang in Carnegie Hall. Here they are in the Grand Central Terminal. On the 19th, a small group, in solidarity with Ukraine, held up signs in front of the People's Forum. Inside, left luminaries were speaking opposing military aid for Ukraine and bleating about negotiations. I spoke with one of the protesters, Walter Daum. I'll be speaking to Walter Daum, a socialist activist, a Marxist theorist, and a retired mathematics lecturer at City College in New York. We're going to talk about a protest of a meeting that was held at the People's Forum in New York. Good evening, Walter.
Hello, how are you?
Good. So why did you go down to the People's Forum on Saturday, November 19th, and not go in, but stand outside with a sign?
Well, this forum was billed as a, a, a an event to promulgate negotiations, not escalation. And what that meant was they wanted the U.S. and other Western powers to stop sending arms to Ukraine. The slogan for this was peace, not war. But when you think about it, that slogan was truly Orwellian. If you remember, in 1984, one of the slogans was peace is war. Peace on their terms would mean Ukraine surrender. Russia could continue its war of conquest against its former colony of Ukraine. It's been a socialist tradition ever since socialism was born to support the struggles of oppressed nations and oppressed peoples against their colonizers and against the imperialist powers that want to enslave them. So any socialist worthy of the name should be supporting Ukraine's right to not be conquered by an imperialist power like Russia. The fact that people on the left are in effect supporting Russia's victory in this war, it is terrible for the good name of the left, and it's particularly terrible for socialists in Ukraine. I mean, even though socialists in Ukraine are supporting Ukraine's war and participating in it against Russia, they are also fighting a neoliberal government which wants to impose a steeper capitalist austerity on the working class and on the peasantry. And this kind of forum in New York by so-called socialists enables the right wing in Ukraine to say, this is what socialism means. And in that part of the world, a lot of people understand that socialism, to them, they think it means Stalinism, which means a very oppressive regime in the name of socialism. So it was necessary for even handfuls of socialists to protest this event in order to stand up for the good name of socialism.
So inside, there were people like Noam Chomsky. He might have been via video, Medea Benjamin, Vijay Prashad, people from the Answer Coalition. So who was outside, and what did the signs say?
There was only about, well, at max, there were 8 of us outside as far as I could see. There was also a goon squad, a defense squad, let us say, of about 30 people, which they didn't really need. We weren't certainly going to storm the place. And our sign said, solidarity with Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to get arms to fight off imperialism. And they were in English and Ukrainian, because it was very important for us to photograph our protest and send this to the Ukrainian socialists so they could make use of it. And we have heard that they were very happy. In fact, before the event, we were trying to contact, first of all, in the U.S., some of the larger organizations or more prominent organizations, but actually most of the American left does not support the right of Ukraine to self-determination. They're more, in one way or another, in effect, supporting Russia or supporting peace, quote unquote, as this event was doing. But we were also in contact with socialists in Ukraine. Now that took a while, and it's only a day or two before the event that we actually heard back from them. And they, for one thing, they helped us translate our slogans into Ukrainian. I mean, they did it. They didn't just help us. None of us here in the group knew Ukrainian. And they also encouraged us to go ahead, even with small numbers of people, because that would be useful for them in defending socialism in Ukraine.
Yeah, the interesting thing, there was all sorts of luminaries inside of the American left, but there weren't any Ukrainians. And this political trend, again and again, has these meetings with no Ukrainian voices at all.
That's interesting, actually. If you remember back to the protests in favor of the Syrian rebels against Assad, they could usually find a few Syrians from the Assad side to come and speak at their forums. It's interesting that they couldn't find any Ukrainians. And one thing about the Ukrainian resistance is it's not just the army this is a popular resistance. People have been, yes, joining the army, but they've also been joining support forces of all kinds to help rebuild the city, to defend, to get information back and forth. It's genuinely a popular resistance, even though there are enormous class differences and class issues in Ukraine that are going on underneath.
My final question, how did you get interested in the question of justice for Ukraine?
Well, one has to be interested in justice for everywhere that people are fighting against injustice and repression. And in particular, in this country, one has to oppose American imperialism and injustice in this country and injustices that this country adopts all over the world. But we also have to be particularly concerned about socialism. When countries call themselves socialist, they have to be held to account, even more than some other countries. And some people still think that Russia is socialist in one way or another, but that's very, very few. But this event was put on by socialists, and it's therefore important for other socialists to take interest in it and oppose their line, which goes against the total tradition of socialism for over a century.
See the full interview by clicking on all our YouTubes at thestruggle.org. This is a tweet from journalist Janine Di Giovanni. She's on the road driving to Ukraine. She was remembering a woman who was killed in Sarajevo, Bosnia, 29 years ago, just as Di Giovanni was starting to cover the anti-Muslim war there. Next up, an interview with a railroad worker, part of a group who are angry with Biden for trying to force a contract down their throats. His name is Nick Wurst. I'll be speaking with Nick Wurst. He works as a freight conductor for CSS. He's a member of Railroad Workers United. He's presently in Boston, and we're going to talk about the contract that the president wants to impose on the railroad workers. So what is Railroad Workers United?
So Railroad Workers United is a cross-union solidarity organization. So we're an organization of railroad workers from all the different crafts, all the different unions, who are committed to a fighting approach to fighting for our jobs and pay and conditions, and pushing for more solidarity and more of a rank and file approach to unionism in our unions, in the various railroad unions, and connecting it to the broader labor movement overall.
All right. So the president has come to Congress and says, Congress, you need to impose a settlement on the railroad unions. And the RWU sent out a press release saying you're very unhappy with the president for that. Could you explain the reasons?
Sure. Yeah. Really briefly, at this point now, every union representing railroad workers has voted on this national agreement, which would cover all of the workers in the Class 1 freight industry, freight railroad industry. So at this point, tens of thousands of railroad workers have voted no. 4 unions, majority, have voted no on the contract. But looking at the other unions' votes as well, there are tens of thousands of railroad workers who also voted no, and their voices deserve to be heard just as much as anyone else. So this contract that Biden is asking and urging Congress to impose on us is the tentative agreement that was agreed to by the various unions with the Class 1 freight rail carriers. There's been a lot of smoke and mirrors about this is the biggest pay package that's been proposed in over 50 years for railroad workers, that it's been negotiated in good faith by the unions and the companies and everything like that. And that's all bunk, to be frank. This agreement does nothing to address the main issues and problems that railroad workers face in the United States in the freight 1 or Class 1 freight railroad system, which are quality of life issues. No sick time. We have no such thing as sick time. You are penalized with attendance points for any day that you call out sick, even if you produce a doctor's note and things like that. A lack of time off for personal reasons, a massive crisis of overworking, dangerous amounts of hours, not enough rest time, and a lack of scheduling that's destroyed people's lives, their health, their families, and on top of all that, this contract includes actually attacks on some of the scheduling protections that are some of the few scheduling protections that exist for over-the-road train crews. And again, it does nothing to reverse the decades of cuts to jobs that have created such a dangerous environment. And
They've cut back on
this
the
thing
numbers.
about
They've cut back on the numbers of
yes,
jobs.
yeah, that's correct. In fact, let's see, I have some statistics here, but maybe one of the most pertinent is that in recent years, the workforce has been downsized by over 30% in the freight class one freight industry. And this thing about highest pay increase, this is, there's a number floating around of 24% pay increase. That's 24% over 5 years. When you break it down, it's less than 5% every year. And this is after 3 years of no pay increases, massive amounts of inflation, spiking costs of living, working through the pandemic, and rising corporate profits of these railroads. These railroads have transformed themselves into some of the most profitable corporations on Wall Street, and have been organizing massive stock buybacks and things like that. So the money is clearly there, not only to provide us with real good pay, but more importantly, to hire enough people and to provide us with things like sick time and more personal time.
Now, in most industries, if the workers don't like the contract, they can go out on strike, and you don't see Congress making laws to force them. But you operate under different laws, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So railroad workers and other workers, in fact, as well. People may have seen some recent headlines around airline pilots organizing around their conditions. So more than just railroad workers fall under what's called the Railway Labor Act, which is a special set of labor law. So it's different than the NLRA that most unions and union workers in the United States fall under. And the Railway Labor Act gives the federal government massive amounts of control and influence in the process of contract negotiations and in dealing with the question of strikes and lockouts. And this is all because railroad workers in the late 19th century and early 20th century waged massive battles for the 8-hour day, for pay, for health and safety, and those shut down the entire economy. And so the Railway Labor Act was created in order to try and prevent railroad workers from being able to exercise our right to strike and our rights to fight for our jobs and our pay and our conditions.
And all the so-called pro-union presidents have never changed that law.
Yeah, this law has been in various forms. It's been on the books since the 1930s, and decades and decades of two-party rule, Democrats or Republicans. It hasn't mattered. In fact, as Biden famously campaigned on being the most pro-labor president in history. Here it's very clear, and in his statement he says as much. He essentially says that he's willing to give lip service to standing with workers until it comes at the cost of, he says the economy, we say corporate profits. The minute that corporate profits are threatened, he's willing to throw us to the wolves.
So what is his alternative, rather than say it's going to devastate the economy and like it or lump it? What could he have done in the last month or so?
Yeah, so like I said, the Railway Labor Act gives the federal government massive amounts of influence in our industry, um, whether we personally agree with it or not. Um, so the fact of the matter is, whether or not we believe that the federal government should have that amount of control, um, the federal government does have that amount of power for right now. And so, with the ability to impose a contract unilaterally comes the ability to impose a good contract unilaterally,
Uh-huh.
right? Um, the things like um, hours of service laws and things like that, which have been updated with federal law, including the Rail Safety Improvement Act in, I believe, 2008. FRA regulations, Federal Railroad Administration regulations, things like that, but also acts of Congress. All of these could give us sick time, personal leave, personal time off. It could give us pay increases. It could give us um, minimum staffing amounts, requirements for safe staffing, protection of two-person train crews, expansion of um, maintenance and other work and safety improvements in terms of the quality of equipment and infrastructure that we work with on a day-to-day basis. So um, the fact is that Biden says that he thinks that this deal is a fair deal and it's one that's been negotiated in good faith, despite years of corporate stalling at this point. So again, they have the power to impose a good contract, right? But they both parties clearly aren't interested in doing so.
Do you think the employers played hardball because they thought they knew that Biden would stop a strike?
Yeah, I mean it's always been, I think, obvious to lots of us that this was going to happen. I mean, the cooling off period and the whole negotiations process was intentionally delayed, in my opinion, by the union leadership in order to make sure that there was no possibility of a strike before the midterm elections, which could, a national rail strike could have done serious damage to the potential for the Democrats to maintain a majority and things like that. Um, and yeah, I think with the Railway Labor Act and with the track record of both parties in terms of support for big business, I think the employers knew very much, had a lot of confidence that um, waiting could only benefit them.
I have to say that it's disgusting listening to the talking heads of corporate TV taking the corporate line that a railroad strike would be a disaster for the country, costing us billions every day. That said, whenever workers go on strike to get a little bit more, it's bunk. Mostly, a strike would mean people would have to wait a bit more for their products. Delay is not a disaster. Who's really good talking about this issue is a professor who talked on Democracy Now! A couple of days ago, who said a short, successful strike would actually be good for the country, giving working people a lot more bargaining power. His name is Nathan Lichtenstein.
But I think that that a delay in Congress coming to a decision on this will enable the rail workers to actually begin a strike. And I think a strike, a national strike, which I think the industry will cave once the strike takes place, because they have the money and they aren't going to go to the mat for their model of egregious industrial relations. A national strike would be a very salutary thing. It would demonstrate unequivocally the power of labor, which needs to be demonstrated. So every Starbucks barista, every UC striker, every worker out there who's thinking about forming a union, they will say, yes, these workers have demonstrated power, and there's enormous public support for the rail strikers, for any striker today. I mean, we're in a very rare moment, and this is the time to demonstrate that.
The next day on Democracy Now!, David Dayen, who's editor of the American Prospect, said that back in 2015, President Obama made an executive order giving all federal workers 7 sick days, but excluded rail workers from the executive order. He says all Biden has to do is make a new executive order including rail workers. Frida Afari will be talking for the Ukrainian Socialist Solidarity Campaign, talking about the Iranian government support for Russia in the Ukraine invasion, and about the uprising inside of Iran. Should be an interesting talk. For details, see rpm.world. We conclude with a few seconds of World Cup player Jawad El Yamik celebrating Morocco's victory over Canada with a display of the Palestinian flag.